Hey guys, thanks for watching. This is going to be a video tutorial on how I clean my knives and other weapons. So I have a beautiful Viking dagger for a client. I did a small cleanup yesterday which I live streamed, but today I'm going to be just showing the process that I do that for those of you who missed the live stream. First of all, I want to say that working from home is totally possible if you just take some precautions. So some of the things that I like to think about are dust. Dust is definitely something you don't want to build up in your house, especially if you're working from, say, a small apartment like I am. There's a few things that you can do that keep the dust down. For example, you could use hand sanding and kind of small scale tools to clean, which aren't going to kick off a lot of dust. And second thing is that you can use water to spray your area, so just kind of putting a bit of a moisture in the air which will grab anything and kind of keep it around your workspace. The problem is when you're working on weapons, especially metal, an excess of moisture is going to contribute to rust. So best thing of all is just to try and not produce a lot of dust. For those of you who are cosplaying and doing a lot of work from home, I strongly recommend using a ventilated area, doing it outside as much as possible, or like being near a window like I am, and making sure that any fumes or gas or anything just don't build up in your house. It's really important. Another thing is getting dust protection for breathing, a respirator or of some sort. I like to use just a small, basic, cheap dollar store dust mask for like small scale work that I know is not toxic. However, I also do have a full chemical mask, which is a little bit of overkill for this job that I'm doing today. Now, for the process of the demonstration, I'm not going to be wearing a mask because I'm not going to be creating any high level of dust that I'm worried about inhaling, but afterwards I will be doing an extensive cleanup, so I'm gonna make sure that this space is not gonna just go off into my computer or into my bedroom or things like that. So workspace, I like to have a clean workspace. It's very much how I work. I know a lot of people work in mess and they're okay with that. Find a style that works for you. My style is clear, only what I'm using in front of me. I want to be able to reach around and grab things quickly. With a rust cleaning job, there's a lot of different tools that you can use. I'm going to show you what my preferences are. Normally, if I was outside, I would be using a brush like this, but because I'm inside, because it's winter and extremely cold and dark out there, I'm not going to be using a brush because it will flick off a lot of the excess off into, far off distances, and I don't want to do that inside my home. So I'm not going to be using the wire brush. So clear that from my workspace. What I will be using is different types of sandpapers, as well as some paste that I'll be using to kind of work away at the rust. I use WD-40. You can also use 3-in-1. It's just my preference because it's easily available, not too gross to clean up. It's water-based, so if you do use WD-40, don't leave it on something unless you're okay with it getting rusty again, because this will not protect it from rust. It's water-based. The other thing I use is toothpaste. So toothpaste will eat into the surface of the metal and help you lift off all the dust, all the rust, dust and rust. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a little paste of the WD-40. I'm just using just a block for a mixing pad. You can use anything you want. You could use the lid of an old container that you're not using anymore. Basically just something to contain the paste. I'm going to spray into the cap because I don't want to just spray into space with an aerosol. So this will help contain it. And it makes it into a little liquid. Carefully pouring it onto the paste. I'm going to take a little stick. It's a tongue depressor, mixing it together. And this is just giving me a nice little paste that I can then use to work on the blade. The other thing you want to have is a rag, or 2 or 3 or 10. You can use old socks that you aren't using anymore, t-shirts. You can get them cheaply from basically any thrift store. They're usually selling bags of old rags or towels or things like that. And you can tear them up, and then you have something useful for your workshop. So the rust on this is not terrible. This is actually it's a fairly easy job to do. Just show you guys more closely. So the blade has a natural blackening from the forge. This is part of the design. So I don't want to hit this part of it. I'm mostly going to focus on this, which is the pretty shiny sharp part. This blade is actually not that sharp. It's kind of, it could cut something if I really tried, but it's fairly blunt. This is the job that I did yesterday, which is almost complete. I still want to I want to take it up to a finer finish, but that's basically what I'm shooting for today. So this is a Norse knife that my client wants me to clean up. This is the case that it came in. It's very beautiful. The inside of the case is actually quite dry, which is why the knife is rusted. It's there's no oil in there. It's like bone dry. So the knife has obviously gone into the case, and there's nothing in there protecting it from, no oil or anything protecting the knife from the rust building up from the moisture. Cool. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to choose some sandpaper after I've mixed my paste. So sandpaper. If you're not familiar with sandpaper and what it all means, there's different types of sandpaper. There's wet and dry, there's dry sandpaper, there's sandpaper for wood, there's sandpaper for metal. Obviously I'm using something that is appropriate for metal. It's available from your hardware store. I would recommend that if you're going to be doing this on the cheap, that you do actually spend money on sandpaper, because it is the only thing that really will make a difference to the final result. Like everything else that I'm using, it's not as important, but you do want to spend some money on your sandpaper. So there's different grades of sandpaper. There's rougher grits, and just gonna turn my heater down. There's rougher grits, and then there's finer grits. And so what you want to do is you want to use a grit that's going to do the job, rip off the rust, and then you have to give the knife back a smoothness. So the rougher the grit that you use, the more you're going to dig into your knife, or rather whatever else you're cleaning. So in this case, what I found out from yesterday is that I don't actually need a very heavy sandpaper to do this job. The rust is coming up quite well. And I don't want to hit it with anything harder than necessary, because that just adds to how much work I've got to do. So I'm using some pretty fine sandpaper. I'm not even touching the 80. So the numbers on the back, the lower the number, the rougher the grit. It's kind of like pixels on a computer screen. So the higher the number, the higher the resolution, or the higher the concentration of fine particles per centimeter or per inch. So I'm going to go with a P100. I'm going to get rid of my 80 completely because I'm not using that. And the other thing about sandpaper is you want to make sure that it's usable. Like once it gets worn out, kind of becomes patchy. All the little grit pieces are no longer they're no longer as sharp. They're not gonna do their job. They're gonna get blunt and filled up with gunk and worn away. So I still keep old sandpaper in the shop because if it's not completely worn out, sometimes it's useful for something. But for the most part, I use fresh sandpaper if I'm going to do a job that I care about the finish of. So it's also, I mean, it's not that expensive, so I really don't need the old pieces. I think this is what I was using. So I'm going to start working on the blade. I want to make sure I have some kind of paste on there. It makes my job easier because it soaks into the metal and lifts up the rust. So I'm going back to my toothpaste and WD-40 mix. I'm just going to spread it on there with my stick. Toothpaste. Why would you put toothpaste on metal? Why would you put toothpaste on your teeth if it works on metal? Ugh. I do actually brush my teeth. I'm just making fun of toothpaste right now. So I've got a nice heavy slather on there. I'm going to let that sit for a moment just so it kind of works its way in to the metal. I'll get my sandpaper ready. So I'm going to use a P100. I've got a P600 here and I've got a P180. Yeah, I think I'm going to use the 180. So when you're tearing sandpaper, it's fairly easy. You don't need scissors to cut sandpaper. It's just going to blunt your scissors. So I'm folding it. Folding it again. Tearing it along the line. And what I'm doing is I'm making some little hand-sized pieces that I can work with. Voila. So I've bent it over backwards on itself, and that gives me a two-sided, fairly sturdy piece of paper that I can then hold in my hand like a little tool, and I can control it quite well. It's tucked into my palm. I've got a lot of control over where that goes. Now I personally don't use power tools when I'm cleaning weapons and armor because I like to be able to feel the pressure that I'm putting on the surface, unless it's absolutely horrendous, like a terrible caked with rust job where I've basically got to cut through, like mining through layers of rust to get to the metal below. It's really not necessary. If there is a really heavy surface of rust, I would use a wire brush, and I would do this outside, where you're just basically lifting it off, like raking the surface of the rust off. But I don't need that for this job because it's tiny. It's a tiny amount of rust. So now that my paste is soaked in, I'm going to use my sandpaper. And I'm going to anchor it to the desk. That just stops the knife from moving around too much and gives me a lot of control. Now, this is not a sharp blade in that if it slips, it's not going to just cut me very easily. That said, if you are worried about getting cut, it is a good idea to take some masking tape, like painter's tape, and just tape up the edge. So you would just put it along the rim, basically, and it just protects yourself. I'm not doing that because I'm fairly confident with my handling, and I also know that this is not a weapon that's likely to slip and cut into me. Also, when I'm holding it, I'm not using great force to hold it. I'm very gentle. It's just enough to keep it in place, and I'm using physics to kind of keep the pressure on itself rather than a lot of kind of brute strength, really. I'm hitting it very lightly. What I'm doing is I'm just focusing on the area where it's dark and discolored. I'm following the tracks that have been left by the person who made the knife as well. And at this point I'm just getting a sense of how much pressure I would need to use. Now I know from yesterday that I know the amount of force that I will need, but I'm just showing you how I go about finding that. And basically I'm starting very light and then slowly increasing the strength until I start to see some of that rust come away. And you can tell by the sound. You can actually tell by how much sound I'm producing, kind of like a string instrument really. The more you push it, the more it vibrates. So I don't know if you can see, but that's starting to take off that dark patch. Now what I am doing is I am gunking up my sandpaper, so that's why it's important to have quite a bit of sandpaper, because it is disposable. It's not a tool that you're going to be reusing 1,000 times. The other nice thing about using paste is it actually traps all the dust. So I'm not producing all these dust flakes right now that are going off everywhere. They're kind of being kept in by the paste. So I said that I was following the striations caused by the person who made the knife, but what I did yesterday was I actually changed the direction on the knife, because I'm going to eventually put a lot of pressure in I'm going to put a lot of pressure in the cleanup, and I want to be able to do it fast, so it's much easier for me to push away from me when I'm doing that, rather than trying to go against the direction of the knife. So, following that, I'm going to be coming down this direction. That also gives me the ability to do some nice long strokes. It's fairly responsive. I don't recommend doing that back and forth. I really recommend just doing one direction, but it's a little hard at the top. The back and forth will give you different lines. So if I go down, it's in one direction, and then coming back up it's another direction. It's very hard to keep them in a straight line, so that's why I recommend just doing one direction only. Most of my rust is gone now, but now I have all these striations on the blade, which I don't want to leave them on there. I want to be able to clean them up. But there's still a little bit of rust, so I'm going to just go up to a finer grit sandpaper and work from there. It's a little bit more work, but it means less follow-up, trying to clean up my own ridges. It's actually getting pretty dry, so I'm going to put a little bit more WD-40. I'm putting the rag down underneath to catch any excess that comes off. There's still quite a bit of toothpaste on there, that's why I'm not mixing up the paste anymore. Oh wait, no, this is the wrong one. Can feel the difference? Is this my 120 or is this my 600? Oh, that's my 600. No, I want my 120. It really is quite satisfying. So it's caking in the narrow part there, and I can't tell if that's the rust or if it's just the buildup of the paste that I'm using. So I'm going to give it a wee clean and see what's going on under there. Aha! So it is the rust. Alright, it's getting a bit more challenging now. Where's my... There we go. So what I want to do is I want to get into that hard to reach spot where the blade is curving a wee bit. It's a bit hard to see in the light, but what's happening is that the rust is kind of hugging the back there. So I want to get in there with some sandpaper on a stick and take care of that. Put my paste on there first. As you can hear, there's a very little amount of noise being produced, which means that I'm putting very little pressure on it. If I were to put more pressure on it, would dig in more and take less time, but I don't mind the extra time because I don't want to go too harsh on this blade. There we go. Sweet. Yeah, that's better. So shiny. So now what I'm going to be doing is just any spots that I missed. There's a little bit at the front that I have to work on, and then I'll be raising the grit of my sandpaper so that I can give it a nice kind of smoother finish than it has right now. It's not necessary for the client, but it's just something I like to do for my own standards, is make it as smooth as possible. Beautiful. There's a little spot there that I need to hit as well on the base. Again, using a very fine grit because I don't want to have to chase my own clean up too much. It needs a bit of paste actually. It's really on there. There we go. It's really not hard for a mild steel tool to get rusty. It really doesn't take a lot of moisture at all. I remember once I was in my full plate and it started to rain and everywhere that the drops of water hit my plate, little pools of rust actually formed within about 2 or 3 minutes. It was amazing. Unfortunate, but also quite fascinating. So I definitely understand why knights painted their armour and wore other fabrics and things over the top, was because the waterproofing was quite important. It was quite common actually for early medieval armour to be painted Unfortunately, there are very few surviving examples of painted armour from the medieval period, because the Victorians decided that it did not fit the aesthetic. So a lot of armour was actually scrubbed clean of the paint that it originally had and buffed back to have this very shiny finish. Not all armour was painted. The later armour pieces, they did embossing instead. Embossing and acid etching. But the early armour was painted because the medieval people loved decoration, and every surface was brightly coloured and highly detailed. And also armour protects metal from rust, which is why we all paint our cars. You don't really see exposed metal cars driving around for too long. This is really very satisfying. In this case I'm pulling towards me because it's easier for me to go right into the tip and draw back rather than drawing away from me, and then I'd miss that end. So I have to go right to the tip and then pull. So I'm pushing with my left hand and pulling with my right. I have to be quite careful not to put too much force into it, otherwise I'll slip. Alright, it's looking good. It's coming along. So now what I want to do... Oh, no, there's a little bit more on the bottom that I didn't finish cleaning before. So I know what I said about the back and forth, but for a tiny area like this, I'm not worried about it, because the lines aren't going to be hugely different to one another. The lines going forward and then back, whereas along the blade it would be a lot more obvious. So scrubbing is actually fine for this part. There we go, looking much better. Cool. So the last thing now is to make it shinier. I do have sanding blocks. I don't use them for knives or swords or other armor because I want to be able to feel the surface. So if I had a sanding block in my hand, I wouldn't be able to feel what I'm working on as easily. I wouldn't be able to feel the pressure and follow the curve of the weapon. Sanding blocks are great if you're trying to keep an edge straight, or if you're doing larger work, but for something as small and handcrafted as this, I really want to be able to follow every contour and not change it too much. So doing 600, I'm moving up to a 600 grit. 100, 600, there we go. So here's what it looks like right now. So you can see the striations still from when I cleaned it earlier with the heavier grit. So I'm just taking those striations and making them finer. That's interesting. I've added some marks to it, so the black is actually, I've pulled it down onto the shinier part. So I'm going to have to clean that. Now, I'm not clamping my knife or anything, but if I was working with something larger, I might want to do that. I don't use steel wool, really. What I would use steel wool for is for the crossguard on a sword. So like, oh look, a sword. So if I was trying to get into these kind of areas, like in and around the hilt and the keons, I would use steel wool because it's better than sandpaper for that purpose. But for actually cleaning the blade, I personally find sandpaper is better. That would be 6 p.m. in Montreal. They still have church bells here that sing. That's really wonderful. I don't know if the microphone's picking it up. Oh, it's looking quite good. So I'm probably going to do about maybe 10 to 15 minutes with just the fine grit, and then I will get it to the point where all of those striations will disappear. See the lines? And then that will be ready for oiling. To cover it with a wax or any kind of protective product, I tend to use a rag. I like to use a mix of beeswax and olive oil. Here's some beautiful beeswax that I haven't melted down yet. It is a little hard to come by unless you have friends who do medieval things, which is why everyone should have friends who do medieval things. If for some chance you can't get hold of beeswax, another product that you can use is actually surfer's wax, which is something that I have started experimenting with, and I've had good results. So I'm just going to show you how I put on the wax. Just take a rag, get a good amount of it on the rag. So this is melted down. This has got soft, very soft and gooey. I'm just kind of working it on there. Anything that goes into storage for a while, like if you've got a sword in a sheath, or you're going to be posting something to someone, or you're just not going to use it for a wee while, it's really a great idea to cover your weapons or your armour in a thin coat of wax or oil of some kind. I prefer this because it doesn't smell so much, but you could totally just use automotive protection. It's a bit stinky if you're wearing it or using it for something personal. There you go. So I've actually just given it a thin coat. It's not caked on there. But when that goes back in the sheath, then it'll keep it nice and safe until the next time it's being used. And then you just take a rag and wipe it off. So that's how I do it. That is the process of cleaning weapons. Also works for armour. So I tend to share this kind of thing under the hashtag the sword doctor or sword doctor. And we'll be sharing any tips or tricks to try and deal with problematic areas. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that all of you are able to use these skills to take care of your own gear. See you on the internet.